So NL Sports Central will be going over your next NFL prediction of this offseason. It will be over the Houston Texans, and this is a team that was 10-6 in 2019, and overall a great season for the Texans, making it to the divisional round. And whether or not this team can make it further in 2020 is what we're going over here today. We're also going to be going over your returning production, along with a full preview and prediction on every game on Houston's schedule heading into 2020. With that, let's look at your season trends from 2019 for this team. They were 6-3 between September and October. And then they were also 5-4 between November and the postseason. So this was a team that was very quiet all of last season. No one was really ever talking about them. And they had a really quiet season. I mean, they were 10-6, so overall they had a great season. But once again, you never really saw them on primetime. This was a team that was very quiet, and they still managed to make it to the divisional round, and they had a great season in the end. They did a couple big wins as well. I mean, they beat the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs on the road, 31-24 on October 13th, and they also beat off the Patriots on December 1st, 28-22. They also beat the Titans, who made it to the AFC Championship game, 24-21 on the road. Then they also beat the Buccaneers 23-20, also on the road. So, overall, the regular season was really good for this team, going 10-6. Then they also were able to beat the Bills, which allowed them to make it to the divisional round, 22-19. They had a big win there against the Bills. So, we all know how good the Bills were last season. That was a team that was a huge surprise team, and they came out of absolutely nowhere and had a great season. And they didn't do as well in the playoffs, but still, that was a big win for the Texans in the end. As far as the returning production goes, you return your quarterback, Deshaun Watson, of course, and he had a great season in 2019. No one was really ever talking about him either, but he had a great season, 3,800 yards with 26 touchdowns and 67, or with a 67% completion rate. So he, in the end, had a great season. He only had 12 interceptions as well, so his touchdown and interception ratio was pretty good last season. You can't forget about that, and that's going to be a huge return for this team. But the thing that baffles me that we've seen this offseason is the choices that the Texans have made. They got rid of their wide receiver one, probably the best wide receiver in the league right now, in DeAndre Hopkins. They traded him over to Arizona for David Johnson, and that could not have surprised me enough. With Deshaun Watson, he's in his prime right now. He's playing as well as anybody, and you get rid of his top receiver and DeAndre Hopkins. That honestly baffled me quite a bit. He's a great receiver, and you need to keep your best receiver. I don't care who it is. That was just not a very good move, but who knows? David Johnson could be a great running back for this team, but in the end, the running back core honestly does not look all that bad heading into next season. He's still got Duke Johnson, which, Duke Johnson, he was their running back 2 last season, but he was able to put up 820 yards and 5 touchdowns by himself, so he still had a great season, even though they got rid of their running back 1, Carlos Hyde, which he had 1,100 yards with 6 touchdowns last season. He's now with Seattle, but as far as the running back core looks, it's going to be a lot different next season. Of course, Lamar Miller, he did not have much action last season, but he's no longer with the team, obviously. And they do bring in David Johnson once again from Arizona, and David Johnson last season, he's a very injury-prone running back, and that's a big reason why I'm kind of concerned with the Texans picking him up, because of how injury-prone he is, and that does. It does concern me in the end, but still with Duke Johnson and David Johnson, I think this running back core will be just fine. I don't think it's going to be great, but I think they'll be fine. But still, if I had the choice to go back and say what the Texans should have done in that situation with DeAndre Hopkins, I would have, no doubt, I would have kept Hopkins in there, because, he's a great receiver. If you look at his season last year, 1,100 yards, nearly 1,200 yards of receiving with 7 touchdowns. So he had a major season as far as offensive production goes. So he's a great player, and that was a very big surprise once again. When I saw that Hopkins was traded, that surprised me a lot. But in the end, he still does have a couple of good wide receivers in there. He's got Will Fuller, of course, their wide receiver 2 from last season. He had 670 yards with 3 touchdowns, and then Kenny Stills is still in there as well, as he had 560 yards with 4 touchdowns. And they also bring in a couple of receivers in Brandon Cooks and Randall Cobb, so that's going to be good at least. At least you bring in a couple of good receivers to try to replace what DeAndre Hopkins did. And of course, both of those players have had really good passes. Especially, Randall Cobb, if you remember when he was back in Green Bay, he was Aaron Rodgers, one of his best receivers at least. I think he was just behind Jordy Nelson at the time. So yeah, Randall Cobb was a really good receiver when he was up with the Packers, and of course he was traded over from Dallas. And he didn't really have as good of a time in Dallas, but still, Randall Cobb, I think, has got a lot of upside. And same thing with Brandon Cooks. He's going to be a great receiver too. Can't wait to see how he does, especially. Of course, he's been all over the place too. So, I mean, this wide receiver core is kind of a toss-up for me going into 2020. I mean, you got 4 good receivers in there with Fuller, Stills, Cooks, and Cobb. But, I mean, in the end, I think you're probably going to see a couple of those receivers emerge kind of out of nowhere. And it's tough to say which ones will right now, but I'm not sure whether or not that's going to be able to keep up with what DeAndre Hopkins did for this team over the past couple of seasons. They do lose their defensive tackle, DJ Reader. He was a great player for this team, so you can't forget about that. One of the best defensive tackles in the league. And you also lose your cornerback, Jonathan Joseph. But you do bring in 2 safeties with Eric Murray and Jalen Watkins, so that's going to be good for this team to bring in both of those safeties. They're both looking pretty good heading into the 2020 season. So overall, for the returning production, it's kind of busy for Houston. I mean, a lot has happened in this offseason for this team. I mean, you're going to be seeing a lot of big changes. I mean, with both your running back 1 and wide receiver 1s being gone, it's going to be an interesting season to see how Houston does. And it's going to be a big change up for Deshaun Watson, too. You can't forget about that. As far as your schedule looks, you start off the season on September 10th with the kickoff game against the Kansas City Chiefs. And that's going to be a road game, and it's going to be a big one. That's going to be a crazy game, especially kick off the season, which hopefully we do kick off the season at that point. But, yeah, they also have another big game against the Ravens on the 20th, followed by a trip to Pittsburgh on the 27th. Then you got the Vikings on October 4th. So those first 4 games are going to be brutal for the Texans. And, I mean, for the Texans next season, I mean, you got to win at least a couple of those games to get yourself on the right foot before you go into the rest of your schedule. But yeah, as far as the rest of your October goes, you play the Jaguars at home on the 11th, followed by a trip to Tennessee on the 18th. Then you play the Packers at home on the 25th. Then you play Jacksonville on the road on the 8th, followed by a trip to Cleveland on the 15th. And then you have the Patriots, Lions, Colts, and Bears in that order. And then to finish off your December, you got the Colts on the road, followed by 2 home games against the Bengals and the Titans. So here's what I'm expecting out of the first half of your schedule. I think you go 5-3 here, and I think you do take a loss against the Chiefs and with the Steelers as well. I do think you get a huge win over the Ravens, though, on September 20th. I mean, that's going to be a huge win. I mean, especially with the Ravens next season looking like one of the best teams in the league, and they're one of the Super Bowl favorites as well heading into next season. So that would be a huge win if the Texans got it there, and I personally think that they do. I mean, the Texans have a long week to get prepared for that game, and I think that they definitely are able to do so, and I think they get a huge win there. However, I do think they take a loss the next week against the Steelers. I think that they prepare a little bit too much for the Ravens, that they kind of lose track of the Steelers, and the Steelers are a team that, honestly, if Big Ben can stay healthy, I mean, that team can look really good next season. I think that they've got potential to have a 10-11 win season. So, yeah, you can't forget about Pittsburgh, but then I think you beat up the Vikings and the Jaguars, and then you take a loss at Tennessee. And I went back and forth on that one, but I think Tennessee is looking pretty good going into that game, and so I think they get the win there. But I think you get a big win the next week against the Packers, and I also think you beat the Jaguars on the road on the 8th. So you come out of that first half of your schedule with a 5-3 record, which really is not all that bad. Of course, it could be better, but in the end, that first half of your schedule is looking really tough right now. I mean, 5 of those 7 teams that you're playing in that first half of your schedule are looking really good heading into next season. And of course, in your November through January, I think you get a win against the Browns on the 15th, and that's going to be a big win there. I think the Browns are going to be a team that could be a potential playoff team next season. Like, I'm expecting 8 to 10 wins out of them, so you can't forget about Cleveland, but I think the Texans get a big win there in the end. However, I do think you lose a couple games after that one. I think you lose to the Patriots and the Lions. Of course, you got the Patriots, and then you've got a short week before having to play the Lions on the road, so that's going to be a very quick turnaround. I mean, the Patriots next season are a team that I expect to still be good, so yeah, I do think that they do take a loss there, but I do think you get a win against the Colts on December 6th, and that's before taking 2 more losses against the Bears and the Colts. So it's going to be it's going to be a bumpy month in there between late November and late December, but you still are able to get a couple of good wins to finish off your regular season against the Bengals and the Titans. So your record prediction for next season is going to be 9-7. Some prediction stats for you: you're going to be 7-1 at home, 2-6 on the road, and then I think you are going to be 4-2 in the AFC South, and then 7-5 in the AFC Conference. So yeah, in the end, your record prediction once again is going to be 9-7. Really not all that bad. I think that's going to get them really close till playoff bid. I'm not quite sure whether or not. Once again, we'll have our NFL playoff predictions coming soon, but it's going to be close. I think the Texans, especially with now 7 teams being able to qualify for the NFL playoffs, I think the Texans genuinely do have a chance to make a big run for it. But in the end, that about wraps up our final prediction for the Texans. If you enjoyed this preview, be sure to slap a like on it and subscribe as well. Really helps out the channel. I'd really appreciate that. But as always, thanks again for watching. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central, and I will see you all later.